Previously on Sodor, the modern years.
Did you have to cover one of Fred's trains again?
You think any engine could handle half a dozen trucks of rubbish? Well, apparently not.
He got sick again?
Yes, of course, I had to cover for him. I couldn't just leave these up at Glennock. Just between us, Sir Handel, I'm beginning to get tired of this. I'm picking up Fred's slack because it's what needs to be done, but every engine has limits.
I've heard talk like that before. It didn't end well. Now, I hope you don't think me impertinent, Rusty, but both Tencent and Drolland let their feelings get the better of them, and Drolland didn't take the time to establish all the facts.
I understand that, but I'm not sure how it applies to my situation.
You did seem pretty angry when you arrived here. I'd just like to ask, can you honestly say that you do know all the facts of this situation with Fred, and that you are not letting your emotions get the better of you?
Those are good questions. Thank you for telling me your story.
You're welcome, Rusty. I'm looking forward to working with you.
So am I.
Hope the house will be empty by then.
Over the next couple of days, Rusty considered Atlas's questions carefully while helping the workmen clear up the last of the storm debris. Fred did pull his weight most of the time, although he did fall ill on a few occasions. Rusty took note of these, and it seemed to him that there was something more going on. One morning, Rusty arrived at a worksite. He found Sir Handel looking very annoyed, taking over a works train. The little diesel didn't need to be told what had happened.
Feeling ill again, Fred?
More or less, yes.
What is it this time? Your carburettor?
Yes, I developed a bit of a cramp in it as I was moving these trucks around. Fortunately, Sir Handel was able to take over.
This isn't the first time.
Sir Handel said, glaring angrily at Fred. He quickly departed without another word. Rusty looked closely at the other diesel.
A cramp in your carburettor, Fred?
That's what I said, yes.
I see.
Rusty didn't say any more, but Fred's answer had been quite revealing. A short while later, Sir Handel was waiting in the passing siding at Reneus station. Skarloey needed to pass through with his passenger train in the other direction before Sir Handel could proceed. Soon, Skarloey arrived.
Sir Handel, I thought Fred was supposed to be taking this train.
He's been taken ill again, apparently. That's how many times this month?
A few, I think. Although, it shouldn't be such a problem after Atlas is restored.
I hope so. This is beginning to get beyond the joke, Skarloey.
I did hear the Thin Controller saying something about Fred going into the workshops when Atlas was done.
Fred's been overhauled before, as I recall. Maybe he'll be made into something. You don't think the Thin Controller will make Fred into a generator or something?
A generator? What makes you ask that?
When I was shunting Atlas into the workshops a few days ago, I saw that the workmen had Fred's drawings and specifications pinned to a corkboard.
Well, that doesn't mean they're planning to make him a generator, though.
But they had a generator there too. A brand new one which they'd only just taken out of the box. It was sitting on the floor near the corkboard.
They did?
Yes. Unreliable or not, I don't think Fred deserves that. I mean, Stanley looked downright miserable every time I saw him.
You're right. That's no fate for an engine. But I'm not sure if the Thin Controller would do that, Sir Handel. After all, Fred does get his work done when he's not ill.
I suppose so.
Before Skarloey could reply, the guard's whistle sounded out. As he got his train underway, a recent memory came to mind. Skarloey had been taking on water the day after the big storm had hit. While he'd been filling up, he'd overheard the Thin Controller talking on the phone.
An extra engine, Mr. Hat? Don't tell me you've found Atlas. You don't say. To be honest, Mr. Hat, I could use another engine to help look after the line. That is rather astute of you, Mr. Hat. As it happens, you are quite correct. Just between you and me, Fred's reliability is beginning to become a bit of an issue.
At this point, Skarloey's driver had finished filling his tank, and the steam engine had had to leave. The thin controller may have just meant that Atlas would be taking on some of Fred's work, Skarloey thought. It wouldn't be like him to turn an engine into a generator. But all the same, Sir Handel wasn't the type to worry without good reason. What he needed, Skarloey thought, was more information. Meanwhile, the workmen had finished, and were preparing to move to their next job.
Rusty, could you look after this works train? My carburetor is still playing up.
Rusty frowned.
Fred, why are you pretending to be sick?
Excuse me, what? You can't know how I'm feeling. How dare...
Diesel engines like us don't have carburetors, Fred. They're only using petrol engines.
But you said... You tricked me.
You mean I caught you in a lie? It's a bit difficult for an engine to get sick in a component they don't have.
That's easy for you to say. At least you know what you've got in your engine.
Well, I don't... Wait, what?
You were built all at once, weren't you?
Yes, by Rushton and Hornsby.
Lucky you. I was cobbled together from 2 old diesels, both of which were worn out at the time.
But you're still a working engine.
Yes, but for how long? I don't exactly know what I'm made of, Rusty.
Oh, that makes sense, I suppose.
That's why I don't want to strain my engine too much.
Rusty looked along the works train. He had seen Fred pulling trains like this before, without any problems, but now wasn't the time to argue.
Alright, Fred, I'll look after the train, this time.
Thanks.
With that, Fred headed off. Rusty left a few minutes later, still worried.
It doesn't make sense.
"What's that, Rusty?" asked his driver.
Fred and his illnesses. I've seen him taking trains longer than this one, without any issue.
As have I. It seems to me that he's the little engine that couldn't.
Can you explain to that too?
There was a book my mother used to read me, called The Little Engine That Could. It was about, well, a little engine who needed to take a train over a mountain. He believed he could do it, put his mind to it, and did it.
I see. You're saying Fred's the opposite. He doesn't believe he could do it.
Exactly. He needs a good dose of self-confidence. A short distance away, Skarloey was just arriving at Lakeside Station. He glanced over as Duke arrived on the other platform.
Excuse me, Duke. I was just wondering about Stanley from your old railway.
Stanley? What were you wondering?
I've heard he was turned into a generator, but I was just wondering what led up to it.
Oh, he never learnt. I'd tell him to behave, the manager would tell him, but he just didn't listen, and kept playing up.
Well, that's a relief.
What do you mean?
Skarloey quickly recanted his earlier conversation with Sir Handel.
I can see where Falcon's coming from, but I don't think there's anything to worry about. Stanley was deliberately difficult. He just didn't care. Fred gets ill, and that's outside his control.
I thought that may be the case. Thank you, Duke.
On the other side of the harbour, a horrified look crossed Rusty's face. He'd overheard every word of the steam engine's conversation, and he knew they had it slightly wrong. Due to Fred's lack of self-confidence, he was indeed being deliberately difficult. It was just that the others didn't know it. Despite his failings, Fred was a friend, and it wouldn't do to have him turned into a generator. Something would have to be done, Rusty thought, but he wasn't quite sure what. Rusty would get his chance a few days later. It was a rainy morning, and Duncan was taking a passenger train down to Craven's Gate. As he brought his train into Glenlock Station, he heard a worrying clunk from his cab. Duncan tried to move.
Driver, would you mind opening my regulator? We got a schedule, you know.
"I'm trying, Duncan. It's not moving."
What do you mean it's not moving?
"I mean it's stuck."
Alright, we got some technical difficulties up here.
Duncan's driver tried his regulator another 2 times, to no avail. "I'm afraid it's no good, Duncan. I'll have to inspect you once you've cooled off."
Oh, that's just great. Who's gonna look after this train?
We passed Rusty and Fred a short distance back. One of them could look after it.
I suppose so. Rusty should be able to do a good job.
News of Duncan's predicament quickly reached the 2 diesels.
Well, I can pull these trucks clear, Rusty. Then you should be able to go out and get those passengers.
Rusty went to speak, then realization hit him. Just a few days ago, he'd been wondering how Fred could develop his self-confidence. Now, This was a perfect opportunity.
Rusty, you alright?
Yes, I was just thinking, maybe it would be better if you rescued Duncan's passengers.
Me? But I'm...
Fred, how many times have you really broken down? I mean genuinely, not just feeling unwell.
Well, 3 or 4.
Exactly. I've had more breakdowns and accidents than that.
Fred glanced along the line.
Do you really think I could do it?
Of course. I wouldn't have suggested it otherwise. Besides, this would also go a long way to improving your reputation with the other engines.
Well, I suppose I could give it a shot.
The foreman agreed, and Fred left to rescue Duncan's train.
Where is that diesel? It cannot take that long just to go a half a mile.
I've heard you're having some operational issues, Duncan.
Operational issues? What are you talking about? I've broken down. That's the sort of euphemism George Carlin talked about.
Yes. Well, I'm here to rescue your passengers.
You? What about Rusty?
Rusty was behind some trucks. I wasn't.
You better get a move on. This train is supposed to meet Bear down at Croven's Gate. It's a guaranteed connection.
Right.
Fred replied. Once Duncan had been shunted aside, Fred set off. He couldn't help feeling nervous. Although he hadn't taken coaches before, he knew they had to be handled carefully. Otherwise, the passengers would complain. On top of that, Fred was also worrying about his engine.
You're doing alright, you're doing alright,
said the coaches as they headed along the line. Fred was glad to hear it, but knew they weren't out of the woods yet. When he reached Krosny Kurin, he found Ivo Hugh waiting.
Oh, hello, Fred. Did you have to rescue Duncan's passengers?
Yes, he had some trouble. It was his reverser, I think.
Ivo Hugh looked along Fred's coaches.
Ah, I see. You seem to be doing alright with them.
Thank you.
You know, if you do a good job, the thin controller might let you pull coaches more often.
More often? But I'm only taking them because Duncan's broken down.
I know, but wouldn't you like to have a change every now and then? I mean, Rusty takes passengers sometimes, when the rest of us are busy or unavailable.
I've never really thought about that.
As Fred departed, he considered what Ivo Hugh had said. Now that he thought about it, he was enjoying himself. Nothing had gone wrong so far. His engine was purring away nicely. He'd had no complaints from the coaches either, nor from the passengers. In fact, Fred found himself beginning to relax. Maybe, he thought, it would be nice to do this again.
Well done, Fred! You've brought them home!
Fred grinned as he passed Reneus. He had been worried when he'd set out to pick up Duncan's train, but now, here he was, approaching Croven's Gate and running with nary a problem.
You're definitely not Duncan. I heard he had some problems.
My name's Fred. I don't think we've met before. I usually just look after the maintenance trains.
I see. Well, you've done a good job. I haven't been waiting too long at all.
Thank you.
Keep up the good work.
It had been good work, as the passengers made clear a few moments later. They crowded around Fred, thanking him and telling him what a really useful engine he was. Fred was lost in thought as he shunted his coaches over to the shed. His engine hadn't given him a twinge nor a twitch all throughout the journey, and he hadn't found it too difficult at all. Perhaps, Fred thought, he had been underestimating himself. Later that evening, the engines had finished their day's work.
Evening, everyone. Fred, I hear a well done is in order.
Thank you.
It is indeed, Scarloe, said a familiar voice. All the engines looked over to see the thin controller standing by the shed. Fred, you'll be getting a new coat of paint after your effort with that passenger train today.
Thank you, sir.
We'll be repainting you once you've finished your rebuild.
My rebuild?
Sir, you're not going to turn Fred into a generator, are you?
We're not going to be turning Fred into a generator, Rusty. Whatever gave you that idea?
Well, Lois says Sir Handel had seen a generator in the workshop. When he shunted Atlas in there.
That's right, sir. One of those mechanical generators that needs an engine to drive it.
I also heard you talking to Charlie Hatt about Atlas and Fred, sir. It did sound as though you may have been planning to replace Fred.
What? Oh, that wasn't a generator. It was the new electric motor for the overhead shop crane. The workmen installed it a couple of days ago. As for my conversation with Mr. Hart, I've known for a while now that another engine would be needed. Our railway isn't getting any less busy.
You can say that again.
Thank you, Duncan. Atlas's discovery was a perfect opportunity to obtain such an engine. As you can hear, he is now ready to run again.
Hello all, I'm Atlas.
Pleased to meet you in person, Atlas. We've heard a lot about you.
Indeed. Welcome to our railway, Atlas.
Thank you.
Atlas, I'd like you to look after Fred's work while he's being rebuilt in our workshop.
Certainly, sir.
Sir, what exactly will this rebuild involve?
You'll undergo a complete inspection and a full clean-out. Not a single part will go uncleaned, and worn ones will be replaced. Fred and Rusty exchanged a look.
Thank you, sir. I think you'll find I'll be an improved engine once that's done.
I certainly hope so, Fred. With that, the thin controller turned and strode away. Atlas looked over at Fred.
So, I'll be covering your work for a few days then. Can you fill me in?
Sure.
Fred replied, and he started filling Atlas in on his usual duties. Early the next morning, Rusty arrived at the slate quarry, where Atlas was helping some of the workmen. The steam engine looked over as the little diesel stopped.
Is it just me, Rusty, or did Fred glance at you before saying he'd be an improved engine last night?
You did, and we've really got you to thank for that.
Really? How so?
Those questions you asked got me thinking,
Rusty said, and he explained what had happened while Atlas was being restored. When he finished, Atlas smiled.
I'm glad it all worked out.
So am I.
Fred soon returned to service, and he was, as promised, an improved engine. Although the inspection and clean-out had done him good, he, Atlas and Rusty knew that there was more to his recovery than just that. He hardly ever gets sick now, and all three of the maintenance engines are good friends.